A boy of 17 walked across a field on the morning of the 1st of February, 1896, in the small town of Fort Thomas in Campbell County, Kentucky, about 8 miles southeast of Cincinnati, Ohio. His name was Johnny Hewling. He worked as a farmhand for Colonel John Locke, whose property stretched across several acres of orchard and open ground on the highlands above the Ohio River, and he was cutting through the northeast corner of the estate, near the junction of Highland Avenue and Alexandria Pike, when he saw something lying in the grass beneath the bare winter trees that stopped him where he stood. A woman was on the ground. She was on her back. Her dress was light blue and white, checkered, the kind of fabric that a respectable young woman might wear to church or to a family gathering. Her hands were visible, and there were wounds on them, cuts and abrasions that spoke of a struggle, of fingers reaching up to defend against something they could not stop. There were wounds on her back as well. Her clothing was soaked with dew and something darker than dew, something that had seeped into the frozen earth and stained the grass around her, a color that Hewling did not immediately recognize as blood. He thought she was drunk. Fort Thomas sat close enough to the military garrison that women from the surrounding towns were sometimes found on farmland in the early hours. He took a step closer, then another, and then he saw that the woman had no head. The neck ended in a ragged wound below the 5th vertebra. The head had been removed with a sharp instrument, and it had been removed with enough force and enough intent that the presiding coroner, when he arrived later that morning, concluded that the decapitation had begun while the woman was still alive. The defensive wounds on her hands confirmed it. She had been conscious when the blade touched her throat. She had reached up. She had tried to stop it, and she had failed. She was young. She was well-dressed. Her shoes were small, size 3, and they were of good quality, not the shoes of a woman who had nothing. She was approximately 5 months pregnant, and she had no identification of any kind, because the only part of her that could have been recognized by someone who knew her had been taken away into the night and had not been left behind. To understand how the investigation that followed moved as quickly as it did, you must understand the geography. Fort Thomas, Kentucky, sits just across the Ohio River from Cincinnati, Ohio. The neighboring towns of Newport and Covington, both in Kentucky, lie within a few miles along the same riverbank. In 1896, these communities were tightly connected by bridges, ferries, and rail lines, and a crime committed on one side of the river could involve suspects, witnesses, and evidence scattered across all of them. The body was found in Kentucky. The killer had come from Ohio. The victim had traveled from Indiana. And the man who would identify her was a shoe dealer who lived 6 miles away. The news reached Newport by midday. It reached Cincinnati by evening. It reached the front pages of newspapers in New York, Chicago, and Philadelphia within days, because a headless pregnant woman found in a Kentucky orchard on a winter morning was the kind of story that the American press of the 1890s understood instinctively and consumed with an appetite that had no bottom. The crowds came to the Locke farm. They trampled the orchard. They pulled branches from the trees. They scooped buckets of blood-soaked mud from the ground to take home as souvenirs. They came not to mourn, but to stare, and they stared with the particular hunger of people who have encountered something so terrible that they cannot look away from it and cannot explain to themselves why they do not want to. While the crowds gathered, a shoe dealer in Newport named Louis Pook heard about the murder and did something that no one else in the entire investigation had thought to do. He walked to White's funeral home, where the body had been taken, and he looked at the dead woman's shoes. Pook was a man who understood shoes the way a jeweler understands stones. He had been a traveling salesman for years before saving enough to open his own store in Newport in 1893. He was respected in the community, a member of the Masonic Lodge and the United Brethren Church, and he had an eye for detail that the circumstances of this case were about to reward in a way that no one, including Pook himself, could have anticipated. The victim's shoes were size 3, well-made, and they bore a manufacturer's code stamped into the leather. To anyone else, the numbers were meaningless. To Pook, they were a map. He could read the size, the stock number. And if he could trace that stock number backward through the chain of production and sale, he could find out who had bought the shoes. And if he could find who bought the shoes, he could name the woman who had been wearing them when she died. He spoke to the Newport chief of police. He was given permission to investigate. What followed was a series of late-night train rides and urgent telegrams, a one-man detective operation conducted by a shoe dealer who understood that the answer to a murder was sitting in the leather of a dead woman's feet. He traced the manufacturer's code from the factory to a wholesaler, from the wholesaler to a shoe store in Greencastle, Indiana, a small college town 150 miles to the northwest. The store had sold the shoes to a family. The family's name was Bryan. The shoes belonged to their youngest daughter. Her name was Pearl. Pearl Bryan had been born on the 25th of October, 1872, in Greencastle, Indiana, one of 12 children born to Alexander Stanford Bryan and Susan Farrow Bryan. Alexander was a successful farmer, a stock breeder and dairy operator of considerable standing in Putnam County. The Bryan family was well known, well regarded, and deeply rooted in the social fabric of a community where reputation was built over generations and could be lost in a single afternoon. Pearl had graduated from Greencastle High School. She was connected to the social circles surrounding DePaul University, whose campus anchored the intellectual life of the town. She taught Sunday school at the local church. She sang. She was described by those who knew her as pretty and charming, the kind of young woman that the community regarded with the particular approval reserved for girls who did everything they were expected to do and never caused their parents a moment of public embarrassment. But Pearl had a secret, and the secret was 5 months along, and it was the reason she had told her parents on the 28th of January, 1896, that she was visiting a friend in Indianapolis, and had instead boarded a train heading in the opposite direction to Cincinnati to meet the man who had fathered her child and who had written to her cousin, in words whose exact phrasing was never preserved, but whose meaning was unmistakable, that she should come to Cincinnati and that he would take care of everything. His name was Scott Jackson. He was in his mid-20s, originally from Maine, and he was studying dentistry at the Ohio College of Dental Surgery in Cincinnati. He had arrived in Greencastle a year earlier, moving there with his mother to be near his sister, who had married a professor at DePaul University. Jackson was charming in the way that certain men are charming, through confidence rather than warmth, through the ability to make people believe things about him that a closer examination would have contradicted. Before coming to Greencastle, he had worked as a clerk for the Pennsylvania Railroad in New Jersey, where he had been involved in an embezzlement scheme. He avoided prison by turning state's evidence against his partner. He carried this history with him the way some men carry a knife, concealed and close and always available. He met Pearl through her second cousin, William Wood, the son of a prominent local Methodist minister. Jackson and Wood became friends. Wood introduced Jackson to his cousin. The relationship between Jackson and Pearl deepened over the summer of 1895 into something that Pearl believed was love, and that Jackson treated as something considerably less permanent. When Jackson transferred to the dental college in Cincinnati that autumn, he cut off communication with Pearl abruptly and without explanation. 2 months later, she discovered she was pregnant. She turned to Wood. Wood wrote to Jackson. Jackson wrote back. The girl should come to Cincinnati. He would arrange an abortion. In 1896, in a small Indiana town where an unmarried pregnancy could destroy a family's standing overnight, this was the only path that Pearl could see, and she walked down it because the man she trusted told her it would lead somewhere safe. Pearl arrived at Cincinnati's Grand Central Station on the evening of Tuesday, the 28th of January. She carried a small bag. She wore her good shoes. She stepped off the train into a city she did not know, carrying an unborn child, and the kind of trust that only the young and the desperate place in people who have not earned it. Jackson met her at the station. His roommate and fellow dental student, Alonzo Walling, was with him. Walling was 21 years old, originally from Mount Carmel, Indiana, orphaned of his father at 3, raised by his mother, a quiet young man who had worked 4 years in a glass factory before entering dental school. He was less prominent than Jackson, less charming, less certain, and he would later claim that everything that happened in the days that followed was Jackson's doing, and that he had been too afraid to stop it. The exact sequence of events between Pearl's arrival on Tuesday evening and the discovery of her body on Saturday morning has been reconstructed from trial testimony, police interviews, and the conflicting accounts of the 2 men who were eventually hanged for her death. What is known with certainty is this: Jackson attempted to terminate the pregnancy. He tried chemicals first. Cocaine was administered to Pearl, either in a drink at a saloon or directly, apparently to sedate her while the procedure was performed. The cocaine was later confirmed in her stomach during the autopsy. Jackson then attempted to use dental instruments. He was a student, not a physician. He had performed or arranged illegal abortions before, according to testimony that emerged during the investigation, but this time the procedure went wrong. Pearl was injured. She was bleeding. She was in pain. The exact words that passed between Jackson and Walling in the hours that followed were never recorded, and any dialogue attributed to them in the retelling of this case must be understood as reconstruction rather than quotation. But the intent was clear. The 2 men had a frightened, injured, pregnant woman on their hands, and they made the decision that would define the rest of their short lives and end hers. On the night of the 31st of January, the 3 of them left Cincinnati. They crossed the Ohio River into Kentucky. The method of transport was disputed at trial, but one account, supported by a witness named George Jackson, a livery stable worker with no relation to Scott, described a man matching Walling's description hiring a carriage and directing the driver across the river into the Kentucky countryside. The driver heard a woman moaning inside the carriage. When they reached their destination, 2 men took the woman into a dark orchard. The driver fled on foot back to Cincinnati. In the orchard on Colonel Locke's farm in Fort Thomas, on a cold January night, Scott Jackson and Alonzo Walling cut off Pearl Bryan's head. She was alive when the blade reached her throat. The coroner's examination and the medical testimony at trial established this with a certainty that left no room for mercy. The wounds on her hands were defensive. She had raised her arms. She had tried to push the instrument away. The cocaine in her system had sedated her but had not rendered her unconscious. She felt what was happening. She fought against it. And the cutting was not the work of a single clean stroke. It was the work of men who were frightened and hurried and who wanted the head removed because the head was the part of her that could be recognized, the part that connected the body in the Kentucky orchard to the girl from Indiana, and they believed that without it, the crime would never be traced back to them. They took the head with them. They left the body where it lay. They crossed back into Ohio, and 4 days later, a shoe dealer named Louis Pook proved them wrong. The identification moved with astonishing speed. Within a week, Pearl's father and sister had traveled to Kentucky and confirmed that the headless body in the Newport morgue belonged to their daughter. The clothing was identified. The slightly webbed toes that only family would know were confirmed. Police learned of Wood's letter to Jackson. Jackson was arrested the same evening. Walling was arrested the following day. And from the moment of their arrests, both men began the pattern that would continue until the ropes were around their necks. "Walling did it," Jackson said. "I was not there when it happened." "Jackson planned everything," Walling said. "I was present, but I did not kill her." The police believed neither. The investigation turned to the missing head. Bloodhounds were brought to the orchard. They trailed a scent to the Covington Reservoir. The reservoir was drained. Nothing. The Ohio River was dragged. Parts of the Miami and Erie Canal were searched. A sandbar in Dayton, Kentucky, was excavated. Nothing. When pressed, Jackson said the head was in the river. Walling said a sandbar. Both said they did not know. A former detective named Cal Krim, interviewed 4 decades later in 1937, theorized that Jackson and Walling had burned the head in the furnace of the dental college, a theory that could not be proven then and has not been proven since. Pearl Bryan's head has never been found. Before the trials began, Pearl's family came to the Cincinnati funeral parlor where her body had been temporarily taken. Her parents, her sisters Maud Stanley and Mrs. Keller, and her brothers Fred and Frank stood around the headless body of their youngest daughter, dressed in the graduation dress she had worn at Greencastle High School. Pearl's sister looked at Jackson, who had been brought from the jail across the street, and begged him to tell them where her sister's head was so they could bury her whole. Jackson showed no emotion. Walling showed no emotion. Neither man spoke. The family took Pearl's body home to Greencastle. The trials were held in Newport, and they were spectacles. Tickets were sold to the public. More than 5,000 people gathered outside the courthouse. Souvenir merchandise bearing Pearl's name was sold from shops near the building. Local newspapers called it the trial of the century. Jackson's trial lasted from the 21st of April to the 14th of May, 1896. Medical experts testified that Pearl had been alive during at least the initial stages of the decapitation. The prosecution argued that Jackson had planned the murder from the moment he told Wood to send the girl to Cincinnati. The defense argued that Walling had been the one to hold the blade. The jury did not need long. Guilty. Death by hanging. Walling's trial followed from the 26th of May to the 18th of June. The same evidence, the same accusations exchanged between 2 men who had conspired to kill a woman and could not agree on which of them had done the killing. Guilty. Death by hanging. The appeals dragged on for months. Execution dates were set and postponed, set again and postponed again, as lawyers filed motions and the governor of Kentucky, William Bradley, waited for one or both men to confess and reveal the location of Pearl's head. They did not. The dates were rescheduled. Christmas passed, the New Year arrived, the legal machinery ground forward. Governor Bradley signed the death warrants on the 17th of February, 1897, setting the executions for 7 o'clock in the morning on Saturday, the 20th of March. The hangings would take place on a white-painted gallows erected at the rear of the Campbell County Jail in Newport, shielded from public view by a high wooden stockade. The threat of lynching was so real that armed guards surrounded the jail around the clock. And when a jailbreak was staged by other inmates during the waiting period, Jackson and Walling stayed in their cells. They feared the mob outside more than they feared the rope. On the morning of the execution, just minutes before the appointed hour, Jackson asked to speak to the attending minister and to Sheriff Julius Plummer. He said something that no one in the courtyard expected. "I know that Alonzo Walling is not guilty of the crime of murder." The sheriff halted the proceedings. A telegram was sent to Governor Bradley. The governor replied that he would commute Walling's sentence if Jackson would confess to the crime fully and reveal the location of Pearl's head. The message was relayed to Jackson. He stood on the scaffold, the noose not yet around his neck, the crowd waiting, Walling standing beside him with an expression that witnesses described as desperately hopeful, and Jackson was silent for a long moment. Then he spoke. "I have only this to say, that I am not guilty of the crime for which I am now compelled to pay the penalty of my life." He said nothing more. He did not confess. He did not reveal where the head was buried or burned or sunk. He had offered Walling a lifeline and then withdrawn it in the same breath, and whether this was a final act of cruelty or a final act of honesty, or simply the last gesture of a man who had run out of things to say, no one will ever know. Walling was asked if he had anything to say. "Nothing," he replied. only that you are taking the life of an innocent man, and I will call upon God to witness the truth of what I say." The hoods were placed, the nooses adjusted. At 11:41 in the morning, the trapdoors opened. Both men dropped. Neither man's neck broke. The drop was insufficient. They died not from the sharp, sudden severance that a proper hanging is designed to deliver, but from slow strangulation, their bodies twisting at the end of the ropes while the witnesses watched from behind the stockade, and the minutes passed with a cruelty that even the men who had ordered the execution had not intended. Jackson was pronounced dead at 12:01 in the afternoon. Walling at 11:55. The bodies were cut down. The gallows were dismantled afterward and never used again. It was the last execution in Newport, Kentucky. Pearl Bryan was buried at Forest Hill Cemetery in Greencastle, Indiana, in the family plot, surrounded by the graves of the people who had loved her and who had traveled to Kentucky to identify a body that had no face and to beg the men who had taken her face to give it back. She was buried with a ceremony. She was buried with her family. She was buried in a casket. But she was buried without her head. In the years that followed, something began to happen at her grave that no one had planned and that no one could stop. Visitors came. Strangers. People who had read about the case in the newspapers or heard the folk songs that were already beginning to circulate through the towns and farmhouses of the Midwest and the Appalachian Hills. They came to the cemetery, and they stood before Pearl's headstone and they left pennies. One by one. Year after year. The pennies accumulated on the stone, small and bright and silent, and the tradition that grew around them was this. The pennies were placed heads up so that on Resurrection Day, when the dead rise and stand before their Maker, Pearl Bryan would have a head. The coins were a prayer and a protest, and a refusal to accept that a girl who had done nothing worse than trust the wrong man should have to face eternity incomplete. The folk balladeers did the rest. In the years following the hanging, songs about Pearl Bryan spread through the oral traditions of Kentucky, Indiana, and the Appalachian communities that preserved their stories in music, because music was the one thing that could carry a story further than a newspaper and keep it alive longer than a generation. Vernon Dalhart recorded the first commercial version in 1926 on Columbia Records, and the song carried Pearl's name beyond the Ohio Valley and into the national memory, where it settled and has never left. 129 years have passed. The orchard is gone. The dental college is closed. The Newport Courthouse still stands, but serves a different purpose. The Ohio River still runs between Ohio and Kentucky, wide and dark, and it has never given back what may have been dropped into it on a January night in 1896. Walling said, as the noose was being placed around his neck, that he would call upon God to witness his innocence. There are those who believe his spirit kept that promise, that the area around the execution site and the orchard where Pearl died has never been entirely still. But if any ghost lingers in the places where this story unfolded, it is not the ghost of the men who killed. It is the ghost of the girl who was killed. It is Pearl, who left her parents' house on a winter morning carrying a secret and a small bag and a pair of size 3 shoes, and who trusted a man who had already decided that her life was worth less than his reputation, and who has lain in the ground in Greencastle for more than a century, waiting for the part of herself that was taken to be returned. The pennies keep coming. They catch the light on sunny afternoons and shine on the surface of the stone like small, bright promises that the living make to the dead. They are placed by hands that never knew Pearl Bryan and never will, by people who heard her story and could not walk away from it without leaving something behind, some small offering, some quiet act of faith that says we have not forgotten you, and we will not let you lie here incomplete forever. Her head has never been found. It was not in the river. It was not in the reservoir. It was not in the canal or the sandbar. It may have been in the furnace of a dental college that no longer exists, reduced to ash and calcium and silence. Or it may be somewhere else entirely, in a place that no one has thought to look, in ground that has never been turned, holding in its bones the face of a 23-year-old girl who smiled and sang and taught Sunday school and made one mistake, which was to believe that the man she loved would protect her. 2 men went to the gallows rather than say where they put it. The ropes tightened. The minutes passed. And the secret died with them, swinging in the spring air above a Kentucky courtyard on a Saturday morning in March of 1897, while somewhere in Indiana a family sat in a house that was too quiet and tried to understand how the world could take so much from one girl and still not be finished taking. Some stories stay with you because of how they end. This one stays with you because of what is still missing. A girl has been lying in the ground for 129 years without her head. 2 men chose the gallows over giving it back. A shoe dealer solved the case by reading a number inside a dead woman's shoe. And strangers still walk into a cemetery in Indiana and place pennies on a stone, heads up, one by one, believing that if enough of them gather there, if enough people remember, if enough small bright coins catch the afternoon light in exactly the right way, then maybe, on some morning that none of us will live to see, Pearl Bryan will finally be whole. If you are still thinking about those pennies right now, if you can feel the weight of this story pressing somewhere you did not expect it to press, then I need you to do something. Tell me in the comments where you believe Pearl Bryan's head is. The river, the furnace, the ground somewhere in Kentucky that has never been searched. After 129 years, someone must have a theory that has never been spoken out loud. Speak it now. And if this story deserves to be heard by more people than the ones who are hearing it today, then like this video, subscribe to this channel, and turn on notifications, so you are here when the next forgotten